Good evening. Welcome to the Special City Commission meeting, Monday, April 29th. Please join me in a pledge to the flag. Thank you. As I stated earlier, this is a special city commission meeting to discuss the results of the special assessment community forums that were discussed. And at this time, I would call on Melissa Richard for that report.
Thank you, Mr. President and Commissioners. Tonight, we're going to walk through the results of the Special Assessment Community Forum surveys and small group discussions, and then staff is going to provide you with recommendations that we came up with based on the feedback we received. What we'd like to do is have staff walk through recommendation 1 and have you ask questions as we go through, and after that, we'll open it up for questions from anyone who has appeared in the audience. Then we'll move into recommendation 2, and again, ask that you ask questions as we go through, and then open it up for questions from the audience. And then we'll go to next steps. As we discussed earlier today, what we'd like to do is offer you the opportunity to just take in the information tonight and then regroup at a May City Commission meeting to ask for your approval on those action items, if that's agreeable to you guys. So we'll go through the survey results first, and this will be a bit of a recap from our previous presentation. I've ordered them again in terms of the questions that they most strongly agreed with to the questions that they most strongly disagreed with. So the first question that had the highest level of agreement is that people would be willing to pay higher sales tax to fund infrastructure projects instead of special assessments. And what I've done is broken this down a little further so you can see the average from the community forums, of which we had 150 surveys to compile, the average of the online surveys, which we had about 240 to analyze, and then the overall average. And that the overall average is an average of all the results at once, so it's not an average of the two segments, if that makes sense to everyone. And then we also did a disbursement on the other side, where you can see how the agree and disagree, the amount of people that chose those. So you can see if some things really turned out neutral, or if they were kind of a split decision based on what we got back. The next strongest agreement or match with that was the idea that they'd be willing to pay a higher lot price for a new home instead of the developments using special assessments. This one, we did want to measure whether or not the special assessment community forums and the event presentation online helped at all with education. We knew that that was an element that we needed to work on, and we got an average of a 2.7, which is just a little higher than neutral on that. So I was pleased with those results. The idea that they can easily find information about the current special assessments. A lot of the information that we shared in the community forums and online was just the process of going to check the Vanguard website to find your special assessment. So that was a good resource that we were able to get out into the community. We got a 2.8 on if they'd rather have us forego infrastructure projects, even if it means decreased services, to avoid special assessments. And that one got a little... the results, you can see the community forum results versus the online survey results mapped a little bit differently on there. Whether or not they understood how the city utilizes special assessments was a pretty neutral response. Whether or not they felt they had a responsibility to seek out information about future projects that could result in special assessments ended up being a pretty neutral response. Paying higher utility fees instead of special assessments. This is where we start to get on the disagree side. So here's where we see the options that they weren't quite as excited about as alternatives for special assessments. They feel like 3.2 on whether or not we complete infrastructure projects that are necessary. And this kind of the 3.2 and kind of matches up with whether or not they'd like us to forego infrastructure projects to avoid special assessments, so kind of neutral on that. I think if they had more information about what that impact would be, I think the results would be a little bit different. understanding how to file a protest against the special assessment was skewed onto the the disagree side. Finding information about a pending special assessment. If you had just taken the survey without looking at the presentation, you would have gotten those results. So there's some of that was skewing that. Whether or not they felt like their input about special assessments was valued because of the event survey was a 3.2. I would have liked to see this a little bit higher, but it's our first stab at it, so hopefully we can continue to increase that result. The lower interest rate for special assessments bonds was getting stronger on the disagree side, so that's not really a message that's a really strong message in terms of benefits for special assessments. Nobody wants to pay higher property taxes to fund infrastructure projects, so that was, I think we know that we don't want to touch that area with the 3.5. This was a question that we added on the online survey because it was a theme that started we had mentioned at a few of the special assessment forums before the online survey went live, and that was the idea of these additional fees like a street utility fee or an impact fee. And it's not a really clear defined concept, but again, I think when we start to talk about adding additional fees, what people really saw the value in was sales tax or a higher lot price instead of these fees. Whether or not we're using the special assessments appropriately to fund infrastructure projects was at a 3.7. It's not surprising. One of the reasons we had this forum was because we were receiving feedback that the community wanted to look into this project or this process. Whether or not they're fairly created by the city of West Fargo, again, a 3.8. Again, the forums were launched because you guys had all heard feedback, and Commissioner Jurdevig, when you were campaigning, feedback that special assessments and the process overall people didn't understand or didn't feel was fair. Whether or not the notification process is sufficient, this was a 3.8. I'm surprised it was even skewed above a 4 based on the feedback that we got in the small groups about the notification process. That's definitely something you'll see tonight in our recommendations. And then finding information about future infrastructure projects, I think that's tied really closely to the idea of just wanting to find information and something that we need to work on. Feel like concerns about special assessments are considered by the city of West Fargo. That was a 3.8. Again, I think that's just indicative of that we recognize the need for these forums, that we needed to look into this topic. And then this is the last question that we asked about, how do you want us to communicate with you regarding special assessments? And as you can see, a letter was a really strong performer in that regard, and then it went to website. And so those are things that we'll keep in mind as we look at those recommendations for communication and where people really want to look for that information. This is just there was lots of feedback from the small groups, and these are the themes that kind of came out the strongest, and that's property owners don't know when a special assessment is coming and when they have a chance to protest the assessment. I think there was a lot of interest in wanting to feel like they had some control over the process of what's going to impact their property and what level of control they could possibly have. Communication needs to be increased and improved. That we heard over and over again, and to be the communications director, that kind of hurt a little, but we'll work on it. The city uses special assessments as a blank check and doesn't properly plan for or fund projects. That's a theme we heard a lot. Certainly we don't feel that way, but I think we can help address a lot of that through our communications and really messaging strongly the need for the projects. Developers should have to pay for more. We've had so much new development, and there's a lot of confusion over the role the developers play and how they use special assessments. So I think with you'll see in our recommendations how we want to address that. And then the idea that sales tax would be a strong option for infrastructure projects was the other theme that we felt we came out a lot. Any questions about the surveys or the feedback that we received, or any comments you'd like to make?
Melissa, how many people were there again, total?
150 overall attended.
Overall, 150?
Yes.
And I guess that one question I have is it doesn't really kind of define as far as special assessments into an area that's already developed and special assessments into an area that is not developed, because
You know, there's a big difference if you have a developer, that's one thing.
Yep.
But if it's a road project or service, there are no developers, so there are no making them pay for more. So
Sure.
how do we take that into account?
I think you'll see from our recommendations that we have some policies that we want to put forth that would address those and get specific into, is it an area of new development, is it an area of redevelopment, and how we would address those different things. Great. So we'll move into recommendations, and recommendation number 1, and I'll have any staff that want to join me up here to take over. The first recommendation is to further develop our managed growth policy to realize cost of growth. And this recommendation, we have, I think it's four different policies that would ladder under this, that would really build this overall managed growth policy. And to set up why we're looking at this now, is that the city is looking at reaching build-out stage in the next 5 years. We don't have very much more land to develop on the residential side, so we're gonna be able to experience a little bit of a slower pace when it comes to development, and that'll give us time to really dig in and develop these. So when it's time for the next development boom, we're ready to go with policies that help the city be in control and plan things out. And then the one thing that we wanted to point out too is that this managed growth policy aligns very nicely with West Fargo 2.0, which is the city's current comprehensive plan. And so we wanted to point out that we continue to utilize the comprehensive plan, and these butt up nicely with those. And just to highlight that even further, there's 2 guiding principles in the comp plan that we thought were really highlighted by these recommendations that we're going to make. And the first is to be fiscally responsible, and the second is to be proactive. I think we all feel that we're being fiscally responsible already, and that we'll continue to do so, but then this idea that we're going to be proactive and plan for the future so we can be even stronger in those policies. And then there's a few, 2 big ideas in the comp plan as well. And the first is to promote transportation and choice mobility. And this has a recommendation to improve network design. And Tim will cover this when he gets a little into it about how network design can help with special assessments and how many are needed. And then the second one is to provide reliable services and municipal transparency. And this talks about adopting an infrastructure investment plan and capital improvement plan. And then formally adopting a policy that categorizes infrastructure saving and spending in the city. So you'll see those play out a little bit stronger as we go through. Also in 2.0 is the idea of strengthening neighborhoods and expand housing choice. So ways to improve design to keep the cost down. Sorry, and that's a repeat there, so you don't have to pay attention to that. So we'll go to infrastructure planning policies, and if anyone would like to step up and help explain this, I'd more than welcome them. Thank you.
Well, good evening. So infrastructure planning.
This gentleman is Mr. Dustin Scott, our city engineer.
Thank you. I didn't realize I was speaking today. So the infrastructure planning policies, there's a couple things, managing the growth plan. So traditionally we kind of sit back and we're a little more reactive to development proposals, and then start working with developers to grow. So things like a policy that will dictate location and timing of city infrastructure. Not specifically the localized infrastructure that is being proposed within a development, but also when we are talking a wide open greenfield, the infrastructure that's needed on a more regional basis. So collector or arterial roadways, our larger lift stations, trunk lines, transmission lines, so on and so forth. And Melissa kind of mentioned it, but adopt a transportation plan for developed and undeveloped areas. So again, just really taking a more proactive approach, and then really holding to that particular plan that's in place. So again, like an Eagle Run that is just going to get started, we would dictate that the collector road will be put in now, it will go here, versus kind of sitting back and letting development occur naturally. Capital improvement plan, and coupling that with our economic development goals, which will, again, better identify areas of growth. Funding policies. So the infrastructure investment strategy that identifies funding amounts from special assessments, city funds, sales tax, state and federal funds for categories of projects. So this is where we get into within our capital improvement plan itself, really being strategic in identifying other means of financing our larger projects where we've traditionally relied upon special assessments. Setting utility rates at levels that will allow the city to create reserves for repair and replacements. We have, of course, our current utilities, but possibly studying and adjusting those particular rates so that we can really focus in on building up a good pot, if you will, or kitty, if you will, that can truly now be the mechanism to rely on maintenance type projects. So getting into special assessment policies, new developments, one of the things we've looked at is, new developments at this point are still going to be potentially funded through special assessments, but really becoming a little more stringent on what is allowed in those developments, or at least within the assessment district program itself. So items like aesthetic features or fences or monument signs, some of those things where in the past we've allowed those to be included within an improvement district, being a lot more restrictive on what's allowed. We have began to draft a policy, and at the end of the meeting I'll hand out a rough draft just to give you an example of what are the items that we're going to consider to be allowed within a new development, but it really focuses on the critical infrastructure. So the sewer, water, the streets, what is critical to make this development function and allow the city to service it.
Excuse me, Dustin. When you say that, is that safety and health basically will be the city's major concerns when dealing with that particular issue?
The bottom line is, yes, safety and health. That within the Century Code itself, there is the very first chapter, or section, I should say, within the special assessment method chapter is, it identifies what expenses can be incurred within a special assessment district by a municipality, but that is more of a generalized global list. This list is intended to be more specific and specifically for working in West Fargo. So it might be okay to do something in another jurisdiction in the state of North Dakota, but in West Fargo, this is our particular list. So, and yes, to summarize it, the best is, health and safety is truly where we're focusing on. Any infrastructure beyond city standards will be paid for by developer. City RAND Development has a policy for sales tax, water, and sewer revenues, and prairie dog funding to help bring costs down, but special assessments could still be used. Redevelopment over $5 million would be reviewed on a case-by-case basis to determine if additional investments would benefit the greater community. So just trying to identify what is a threshold, if you will, when we're talking redevelopment. And for now, we put in a placeholder of $5 million that is maybe too high, maybe too low, but we're trying to get a little more specific into not just a blanket statement that we need to review each redevelopment project, but let's set a threshold so that we know this is now kicked into that next gear. Same thing with back to the developer requested improvements. We've said that we would still utilize special assessments, but maybe there is a threshold to where if a developer is really requesting a small localized improvement, such as potentially the improvements for Hornbachers, if the cost is expected to be less than $500,000, we suggest having the developer finance that privately. And that, again, just alleviates the need to get into the administrative costs and the city's responsibility to administrate an assessment district for those improvements. Continuing with new development policies, require master planning for new developments, covering preliminary engineering for all public infrastructure and that adheres to our growth plan. So what this is really trying to say is we're going to be requiring a developer to do a lot more preliminary engineering work up front before we approve a plat, and this might mean expending costs on a consultant to perform studies, to lay out utility or street plans, analyze the infrastructure that's going to go in, and then ensure that it is following our infrastructure plans.
Dustin, if we were to go that way, when we talk about low-income housing and affordable housing, would we not actually be increasing? Because these developers aren't just going to pay out of their pocket; they're going to get paid back by selling those lots, homes, or whatever. It seems some of this may actually increase the price of that home rather than keep it low.
Well, potentially, yeah. We are certainly saying that a developer, instead of just coming in with a raw survey plat, would have to do more of the preliminary engineering work up front. But we are already requiring some of that anyway. The difference is the city would likely incur some of those costs with their consultants to evaluate the infrastructure that's going to be designed. So we're more or less putting the preliminary design efforts and the studies back on the developer. Yes, you're right. Those costs could be translated into a higher per lot cost. It's difficult to measure exactly what that would be, but inherently it's a very true statement.
Thank you.
And then design standards that have potential to reduce the overall tax burden for property owners, particularly that of special assessments. We feel like our standards are good, they're in place, but things can always be improved. And so we would certainly go back through, can we decrease the widths of our streets? Are there certain things within our design standards that we can start to reevaluate and become more efficient? And that's an ongoing effort that any municipality should really be engaged with. So, moving into back to our capital improvement plan, certainly is the catalyst for a lot of these things. Identifying not only the projects and the need within our community, but really getting into the strategic and financial budgeting aspects of this. And so again, really working towards our better financial forecasting and of course the transparent communication that goes along with that. We would recommend that we invest in resources and strengthen the process of planning and managing the capital improvement plan so that it can become more of an interactive or public resource. Yeah, so we're getting up to the last slide within this first recommendation here, so I'll let Melissa finish up.
So as you can see, there are a lot of policies there that would be layered under this managed growth policy, and when we were thinking about how we would strategically deploy those and how they all kind of work together and how there might be some best practices that overlap, we thought a great idea was to create a staff committee that oversees the infrastructure financing best practices. So not only would they be meeting to discuss how projects are coming to light, what the financing is it following the policies that we've already laid out, but also looking at some new ideas and things that we can implement. And this is where we thought the best place for some of those strong themes we got from the survey were as well, to really dive into those. So the idea of requiring developers to fund all development on their own instead of, or using sales tax instead of special assessments, that's something this committee could dive into and really research. The idea, maybe, adjusting sales tax always has some implications in terms of business and picking West Fargo to do business in and choosing to shop in West Fargo. And so maybe there are some different economic tools that we can use to increase the sales tax without having those business impacts or still being a an attractive business to a city to come to do business. And then there's this idea of annual subsidies for income-based special assessment breaks. I don't know if Larry, if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that or your idea behind that. So the idea was if you met a certain income threshold, that there might be some grants or some subsidies that we could provide to you. And the city of Fargo has a program right now. They're a lot different than us because of the different funds and sales tax they have to facilitate that.
There's some things that we're exploring on it. We're looking at what kinds of federal dollars might be available to help in some of these, and particularly as we're looking at the downtown, the core infrastructure study that is being done, and the older neighborhoods there that probably are more akin to lower incomes or moderate incomes, and would have more difficulty, looking at special assessments for replacing the old infrastructure, and the cost of replacing it would be pretty significant. So exploring, potential grant funds, sales tax, other types of things, I think that's a discussion that we need to have.
So that wraps up recommendation number 1. Are there any further comments from the commission that you'd like us to address on this particular recommendation? Yes,
Commissioner Thorstad.
A couple questions regarding the sales tax, which apparently brought a certain amount of positive interest, I guess, from the respondents. But would that be geared just towards replacing infrastructure and not towards new areas? Would that be? And then again, I think you touched on it, but obviously we'd have to touch base with the commercial residents, I guess, so you want to say the taxpayers in our city, because if our tax were to get higher than other nearby entities, that does have effect on commerce. And I don't know how much our sales tax raises now, and I think we'd still end up having to find funding somewhere. It would take the edge off, but it's not going to be a solution, if I'm correct. The other question would be regarding regionalization. That seems to, at least a lot of the complaints we've had, and legitimately so, are people that live in areas particularly new where, we've parsed out pieces. We do it in piecemeal. We do it in 5 developments or 6 subdevelopments or 8 or whatever the number is. Someone moves in the first 1 or 2 and they believe, they've assumed a certain amount of specials and that, that's what they're going to have to pay. Then all of a sudden another subdevelopment is added, and then another one, and we have to fill out this regionalization, be it sewer and water, and I know we've had a number of those instances lately. How can we get to the point, now granted right now, like I say, we're about built out, but as we develop larger areas, how can we get to that point to where perhaps we could have all the regional sewer and water, and I think Dustin talked about the arterial streets put in at the front end. I think part of the problem, and you can explain the problems, is if it's all one developer with a fair amount of resources, it probably could be done, but it seems like a lot of our Eaglewood or whatever are different developers that comprise that regionalization. So that seems to be one of the problems, is again, a lot of people are getting hit with a special, and then 2 years down the road hit with another special as more people join the system, so.
And before you, just to point it out, on slide 33, that first bullet under new development policies and the requirement of the master planning was one policy that we hoped would help with that, so you knew at the front end going in, this is the total plan as you buy in.
Yeah, and I think that's fine, but then how do we implement that? How do we get developers to put that all in at the front end? And, if we do it and we special assess it, I would assume that the special is going to be tremendous amount of money, and that in itself could really stymie the development of that property.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's certainly, like you mentioned it a little bit, but there's two categories. One are the utilities that we certainly can force those in because that's not a protestable improvement. So we could require that if we're going to start in a new section of land, regardless of who owns what, we can put in all the regional utility work. So the sewer, water, trunk lines, the storm water, so on and so forth. There's a consequence of that. Whoever owns large tracts of land, whether it's a farmer that's not ready to develop or whether it's a developer that owns a lot of the land and is ready to develop, will incur a lot of special assessment costs. There's one way to mitigate it, and that's deferring assessments, entering into agreements for that. But as Tina just pointed out, we don't have a lot of sales tax revenue to really start carrying a lot of those costs. But so we can though move forward with at least forcing some of that in. The streets are a whole other challenge because we're experiencing this a little bit right now in South Wilds, where we want the rest of our collector street to go in, but we don't control the land, or the developer could easily protest out an assessment district. One way to deal with that is if the developer doesn't acknowledge or sign over a petition for the creation of an assessment district for collector roads, then we won't approve a plat. But in such cases where we're dealing with a section of land, it's oftentimes one entity obviously doesn't own that entire stretch. So yeah, there's some nuances there, and that's why we kept it a little bit simplified for the sake of this by saying we're going to require at least a master plan. But your detailed question is exactly what we were kind of anticipating. We don't quite have the answer yet because we don't know exactly what kind of cost implications there would be if we were to, say, defer assessments on something like that. We don't know, if we would really want to go down the path of forcing in everything if it's the first 20 acres within a section of land, so on and so forth. But we wanted to take at least the initial step of requiring the master plan, and then along with that is the engineering work behind it to know that it's a master plan that will work and will be implemented. Versus, sometimes a developer would put together a colored drawing that identifies here's all the pretty development we want to do, but there's little to no engineering behind certain things, and we don't know.
Just last question, and I haven't seen one, but is there ever been a study that's done that can give a comparison between, let's say, a city-funded versus a developer-funded as far as cost to the actual consumer? I mean, everyone would like to see the developer take it over and they don't have specials, but we know the developer is going to want to recoup his investment with, I would assume, a profit. I don't know if there's been anyone anywhere that's ever done a study to really give good data as to which is the better way to go, because I think we'd all like to have less specials, but again, if you're going to go buy I guess we're talking new property here again, you're going to buy a new property, that developer is going to want to recoup his investment along with any type of margin he wants to have on top of that. Okay, and last comment, and I'll be quiet for a while. Existing infrastructure. I know we've got a plan in the works, or we're working on a plan to list and prioritize projects. One of the comments on here, strong comment from people too, is are we doing things maybe we don't need to do or shouldn't be doing, or the timing on doing that? Is that something we're working on, and so that we can come up with okay, here's a list of all the things we believe, we know we're going to have to replace this, at some point, but we don't have to do it for a few years, so we can prioritize so these people understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. That was one, again, strong comment. They don't want us doing things, just for the sake of doing them necessarily, and I don't think we have. I'm just saying we need to be able to say, here's our plan, here's what we need to do, and this is why we need to do it, and this is our anticipated cost of doing that, and of course, how we might fund it. Well, are we continuing to develop that plan? I know we're still waiting for a study from one of the engineering groups to tell us about our existing infrastructure.
I think I can touch and give you a little.
This gentleman is Mr. Chris Brungart, Head of Public Works.
Thank you. Commissioner Thor said, I think in our existing core area infrastructure study, we're taking a look at a rating matrix, and through this matrix, we're taking a look at the condition of our sewer, our water, our storm sewer, and the pavements, and we're kind of layering each one and giving one a weight. So the whole idea of this entire structure, of the entire matrix, is determine if the sewer's in bad shape but the pavement's in good shape, what can we do to extend the life of that sewer so we're not ripping out good pavement. But likewise, if we have bad pavement, we need to replace that. What's the condition of the sewer? Knowing that if we reconstruct the pavement, the sewer probably won't live the lifespan of that pavement. So we're just trying to play those two off together, and when we get a score of all the matrices together, we should be able to prioritize our projects and go forward. I think one of the big goals that we're kind of looking at as a whole group is to keep our investment in our infrastructure as long as possible, so we can do that maintenance cycle and keep that as good as possible. Just like if you're going to reshingle your house, same type of thing we want to do with our roads and our infrastructure.
Thank you.
I guess I would expand upon question Commissioner Thorstad asked Dustin in terms of, with new developments, the question of, whether they're funded through assessments or developer funded, and that is whether or not there could be a hybrid model where, so much per square foot would be allowed through a special assessment, and anything over that would be required to be put upon the developer, because it would create an incentive to control costs. And I think that would just be an interesting thing I don't know if there's any cities out there doing something like that, but it would be something additionally to research, I think. I think from my point, though, is your guys' response is actually exactly why I think we should look at doing something like that, in the sense that I'm not sure that the developer that we should completely protect them from the variability of costs. There should be an incentive in the model for them to control costs, where today they know that every cost is just pushed over to assessments. And I think finding a way to make an incentive there for them to control costs, because if it goes over X dollars per square foot or whatever it might be, that it has them now focused on the bottom line as well, where today I don't think that there's as much thought to that piece of it. Anyways.
Commissioner Simmons.
Thank you. I have one question for Melissa, just real quick, and then I have a comment. Melissa, during this entire research that we've done in the studies, have you once reached out, or anybody reached out to Fargo Moorhead to see how they're moving forward and how they're doing?
In terms of?
In terms of what we're talking about tonight.
In terms of special assessments?
Yes.
Bernie has been sitting on the Fargo
Right,
Special Assessment Committee, and no, I guess we haven't.
I figured that was the answer, and I'm not. So the reason I'm saying that is I think that as a commission, a builder doesn't care if they're in West Fargo, or Moorhead. They just care that they want everything to kind of be the same. They want it to be as transitional as possible. I think that we have to be very, very cognizant up here that we do have Fargo Moorhead to the east of us, and that we are a metro area now. We're not just West Fargo, and that what we do, we have to at least discuss it with them and talk with them and coordinate, so we have some continuity, I guess. I feel I don't want us just to go out into left or right field, wherever you want to go, by ourselves. That's just a comment of mine that I think we should have that.
For the commission's information, Mayor Mahoney from Fargo reached out to me just this morning and asked that I provide him with a copy of this. The next special assessment meeting of the regional one for Fargo, Moorhead, West Fargo, Gloria from Beyond Realty is in the crowd this evening. She also serves on the committee with me. And so we will be sharing this report with that group on Friday. And they're very inquisitive as to what our findings were here, because as you just suggested, Commissioner Simmons, we are one community in the sense when it comes to development, and we need to be, I'll excuse the term, but I'll use the word competitive. So, Commissioner Olson.
Just one question. We are limited in what we can do with our raising of funds by the state legislature, right? Like tacking on different fees here and there. So we are kind of limited. So your recommendations within here would fall within that law, that we're not creating something outside of that law, right? Okay. That's a difficult thing.
Yes, sir.
We can't go outside the box too much. Or if we can get to the boundary and then we're stopped because of the law won't allow us to go out and...
North Dakota Century Code does have some provisions of what we can and can't do. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tim Solberg, Head of Planning and Zoning.
Thank you, Your Honor. I just wanted to touch a little bit on Commissioner Thorsted's regionalization comment. I think we already are making headway in the area planning requirement. And to speak on the cost of that, when they do the preliminary engineering, that is a cost now of the developer. When they don't do the preliminary engineering, we do it, and then we assess it later because we have to pay for it. Another part of the preliminary engineering that's really important is we start to understand, do they need the pond that big? Do they need the road that big? Are they efficiently developing this? So I think we've started to do that already. We have a review committee, Chris and Dustin and fire and police are on that. And we start to really look at how that can develop more efficiently. What we're proposing on the transportation plan and other infrastructure plans is that the city now has a bigger driver's seat in this. When we look at a greenfield, a bare piece of land, we set up where that collector needs to be. We set up where the most efficient way of networking through there, either pedestrian, cars, whatever it may be, sewer, water, so that we can then make sure that that section of land is developed the most efficiently we can. So I think that's what we're already starting to do, and that's where regionalization, things like that, we'll know up front before, Eaglewood first, Eaglewood second, Eaglewood third comes along. We're going to need a pond, and it's going to probably cost this much. So not only are they going to have to say the pond's going to be here, but they're going to have to size what that pond is going to be, and we're going to have some preliminary thoughts about what that's going to cost. So as Eaglewood 4th, 5th, 6th comes along, there'll be probably an easier way that we can communicate to the public how much that's going to cost them someday. So just wanted to make sure that we summarize that for you guys.
Thank you, Mr. Sober. Melissa, in your process this evening, is your intent for us to call for public comments on recommendation number 1, or are we going to do it all at the end? What would you prefer?
I prefer we do per recommendation. So
okay. Okay. So at this time, I would invite anybody from the public to come to the lectern. Please state your name and your address. If you have any comments on the first phase of this of recommendation number 1. Please step forward if you're welcome to address the commission. Thank you, Mrs. Fisk, our city administrator. Sir?
Hi, I'm Jamie Workman, 1129 5th Avenue West in West Fargo. I just wanted to make sure that you guys consider within the recommendations, and you may within your details on this, I get that, but want to make sure that you are also considering cost control, like some of you have brought up within it, because rebadging this, the idea was people are thinking special are getting high. Rebadging this as sales tax or spreading it across as other stuff doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be more efficient with it. So the bids, I think, are an important thing because human nature with people being busy, if you set your bid cap high just because you don't want to refuse it and rebid it around, then that allows bids to grow higher. And yes, it keeps it going. And I understand that you want to develop, but there is a limit at times when the market is pushing that costs are super high. Sometimes maybe it really should be weighted upon because it's just blindly getting thrown into there. And by, I think if you're judicious with your sales tax use and those, it would be okay to do. But I think the side that comes out later, right now everyone hates specials. So everyone's going to say, hey, get rid of specials, get rid of specials. Hey, we'll put it into the utility bill. Well, now the next thing they're going to realize, oh, okay, everybody's servicing this. Oh, their street over there is 3 feet wider than mine, or this is this. You're going to get into legislating fairness, which is a very, very slippery slope as far as that. So just be cautious upon that stuff, that when you start throwing it across, you lose some transparency because it does. It desensitizes it, which maybe that is what you desire, but if at the beginning of this was for cost savings, desensitizing that part is not necessarily good because you lose the transparency. You're putting it into just other areas. Politically, it sounds good, but I am an accountant, so within that, it doesn't necessarily encourage true cost savings as it was. I mean, we can call this the Affordable Specials Act, but it doesn't mean that it actually is going to make it that way. So I just want to make sure within this that you're considering those items to keep that cost down as much as you can. It's never cheap. There's nothing is free. So no matter where you put it, it's going to cost money. It is important to develop as a city, I think. If you're not, you'll start to shrink. And that's where a lot of the controls, I think that's a good idea to get more controls on. But there is a limit there too, because if you start dictating everything, then the developers aren't necessarily going to want to put their money in as much on that because they have to turn around and sell this too. And if the public doesn't want it, ultimately there still has to be a buyer out there for these items. And so you could slow down. Now, if there isn't that much land left in West Fargo, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's about the right pace to finish it out. But the more that you put clamps on it, harder it becomes to market. Now, naturally, prices go up too, just because people aren't going to want to do it unless there's a return on there too. So it's a little more complex than it can sound politically at times. So really, I don't know if this is helping, but I just wanted to get that in there to make sure whatever we can do with the cost, which includes the bids and the items on there, and stipulating that, I think is going to be very important.
Thank you, sir, for your comments. To answer one of your questions with regard to transparency, I don't believe that this commission will ever sacrifice that under any circumstances. Thank you. Come on up, Bob.
Bob Jensen, 4406 South River Estates Way. I listened to all the recommendations here and what was said, and there's a lot of good ideas in there that I think could be expanded further. Some of the things that I've wondered about, it seems like our development in the city, we wonder which one comes first, homes or schools. A new school pops up, guess what? All of a sudden there's homes built around that. And I've often thought maybe the school should have a line in their bid process for infrastructure cost that would go in that area to help cover the development of that area. Now you say, well, that's going to come back in form of school taxes. But I would say, yes, that is true, but school taxes aren't only collected in West Fargo. They're collected in a good area of Fargo. So it might be a way of somewhat spreading that cost out to everyone that's going to benefit from that development in form of good schools. But when schools are built, you build a school out here, next thing you know, there's all kinds of new development going on around it. Just like the one that's going to be built down south between here and Horse. It's not long, there's going to be roads, streets, and everything else that's going to have to go in there. And it's really not fair to the people right in that area that they have to cover that cost, because there's some developers that are reaping the benefit of that. Another area that I would like to just throw out there, it's just an idea off the top of my head, because we talked about ponds, especially over in the wilds, there's all kinds of ponds. And I don't know how that gets expensed out to the lots, but it appears that ponds are a selling item to those homes. When you look at the paper on homes for sale, they all say pond view, which means to me that's adding value to that home. Now, who should pay for that pond in that development? Just a thought. The other area that I want to raise concerns about assessments is on roads. That's probably one of our biggest assessment areas that we're faced with. And when I look at a assessment that says so much up to 2 acres and over 2 acres, it's a different rate. And I think, we look at charging per square foot or lineage on that road out so far. Wouldn't it be better maybe to think outside the box and charge that assessment on the number of vehicles owned within that assessment district? Because the people that are using it are the people that have the vehicles. I live on a 2.5 acre lot. I have 1 vehicle. That same acreage over someplace else could be 10 homes or 15 homes, 2 vehicles each, 30 vehicles. If there's a way to assess additional vehicle tax in those areas. And as far as comparing ourselves to Fargo and Moorhead, there are a lot of areas in our surrounding areas do not have assessments. You can go to South Dakota, there's no special assessments on there. So we should maybe be also looking at how are they doing it versus what our neighbors are, because we're all in the same boat. It's got the same holes in it. Let's get outside the boat and go look out someplace else and how it's being done.
Thank you, Mr. Jensen.
Yep.
Is there any additional public comments on recommendations number 1? All right, moving on. Melissa?
Okay, well, I think we can, recommendation number 2, I don't think will be any surprise, but it's really increasing communication to provide a better idea of special assessments, infrastructure projects, and the process of paying and protesting. So recommendation number 2 is to implement a comprehensive communication process. It's supported in the comp plan under the idea of providing reliable services and municipal transparency. The recommendation is to become a digital city and provide greater access to information and analysis via the internet. You heard a little bit of that when we talked about the comp plan in the last recommendation as well, that it needs to be a resource and a tool that our citizens can access and utilize for information. I'll kind of skip over this. This is just talking about how survey respondents and the responses we received were very much online, that the notification process wasn't good enough. But if we looked further into the small group feedback that we got, it wasn't just necessarily communication around special assessments. It was about, as we've heard, when do we decide to do an infrastructure project? What is the benefit of the project? How will it impact my property? What is my opportunity to protest that project? And so we want to look at a campaign that really starts with the first step of knowing that this project is coming, and that would be a part of the planning process, the capital improvement plan when that comes to be, communicating that out, and then building awareness for why those projects are necessary, when they'll be executed, and then how that all layers into the special assessment process. We've already started to look at what Fargo is doing with their finance software to provide letters of notification to residents, and that's something that we'll most likely be diving into, and at what points we can do that. I believe we've discussed too that Fargo also has notes of when you can protest and what that looks like, so that's another layer that we have to put in there, that we want to put in there, so our citizens can feel empowered. And that's pretty much it for recommendation number 2.
Thank you. Any questions of Melissa from the commission? Comments? Okay, thank you. Is there any public comment with regard to communications and notifications?
Richard Lewis, 103 48th Avenue East. On the communications, I don't know how you, when it comes to the communications, when you got a project, one most of you know that I was not happy with was the retention pond down there. You got to be able to defend your project. When you go to the city staff and you get about 3 different answers, and you point out to them why they might not work, and it gets to the point where he says, well, I don't know where your water goes, but it's got to go somewhere. That's not a good answer. It just frustrates people. So then they move on and go to the city hall, try and get answers there, and they aren't answered in a timely manner. That doesn't help either. So then the third thing I want to say about it is when people come in and want to express their opinion and they're critical of city staff, I don't think it's appropriate that the city commission chastises the public for doing that and tells them that they shouldn't be doing that. That is all part of running the city too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis.
Robin Anderson, 108 Francis Street. I'm going to go a little slow here. First, I'd like to say that over the last few years I have seen improvement in the communication process, which I appreciate. So I live in an area where there are a lot of older people and younger families coming in. It's downtown area. One thing, there's a lot of talk about new development and stuff, and getting more for the having developers spend more money, within their development, that sort of thing. Don't forget the downtown area. Don't forget the existing residential areas. It seems like at times we are forgotten. One thing about the communication is when there's talk about becoming a digital city, a lot of people in our neighborhood that we've talked to don't know what's going on already. They're not people that are online a lot. If they're on the internet, if they're on Facebook, it's to see pictures of the grandkids when they're ready to go to bed, that sort of thing. They're not there to see city posts and stuff necessarily. So we need to keep that in mind too. So there are people that don't use the internet like some of us do.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Is there anyone else that would like to speak to recommendation number 2 with regard to communications?
Jamie Workman, 1129 Fifth Avenue West. I would like to say kudos to the website of for looking up the actual parcels and things. I think they've done real well with that. I think a lot of information on there, pictures, a lot of things. It's a very good website, and always looking to improve is important, but I just want to also acknowledge the accomplishment that's been there. And the point, and I don't know if this one's financially feasible, but if there was a way, would I like to see brainstorm on the notifications to get a positive confirmation of the receipt. Right now you go off of negative, which means you send it, if you hear nothing, you assume it's fine. I don't know if we get to a digital age or an area sometime where either through mail, email, wherever, or maybe multiple ways, there was a way to truly get them to acknowledge, and yeah, I get that there's big pitfalls to that, so it might not be feasible today. But when you can get to that where every citizen is saying, yep, I got that, then that takes a lot of that out of there, of the anger, because a lot of times, yeah, if I went to the mail and it looked like junk mail and it got thrown out, and they don't know they had it, and then now you do what you need to do, and nobody's really in the wrong there. But at the end of the day, there's still people that are not very happy about it. So if there was a way to brainstorm a system for positive confirmation, I think that could help a lot.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else?
Just a comment, Mayor.
Commissioner Thorstad.
On recommendation 2, are we also going to continue our work to involve the developers on this communication process? I think we've engaged them a couple times recently. Eaglewood, I think, comes to mind, where we had to expand and we were trying to exceed what you would say your normal notification area would be. And I think that's important too, that they're the ones kind of, I won't say causing the problem, but they're starting the ball rolling down that street, and they should be part of the process as well. So I'd like to, even if it's a financial obligation to them to fund that the city gets the notifications out, and if that takes hand delivering letters or whatever, I agree with the previous gentleman's comments. It's, sometimes we think we send out notifications and people apparently don't get them, or something happens along the way, but I think it's important that they, at the minimum, would have a financial obligation, and they certainly, I think, have as much obligation as the city to let people know what's going on.
Commissioner Thorstad, we did, yes, send out, like for the Eaglewood, we sent out a letter. One thing that comes to mind from the gentleman's comment about it looks like junk mail, maybe one thing we could do so our letters don't look like junk mail is have some kind of red marking on there that says assessment information enclosed or something like that, so that, I mean, we all should open our mail, but I get the difference. So if we just had something on there that caught their eye when we're sending them out anyway. And yes, we do have the developer, we require them have required them the last couple of times to be there and supposedly set it up, but a lot of times they're not very good about facilitating and carrying through with it. So we do engage staff, and Dustin's been great, and Melissa helps get things out, and Courtney, and so we do intend on continuing to do that, but I appreciate the comments because that's one thing we could add.
I think that's an excellent idea, Mrs. Fisk.
Absolutely. Yep, great comments. That is actually the end of our recommendations. I've just recapped what really, in a nutshell, that last page is what we're asking for you to take a look at and provide us feedback on how you'd like us to move forward. At this point, I think if you're comfortable, what we could say is just give you the content and let you think about it, and come back with any more comments that you want to provide us, and come back sometime at one of the May Commission meetings and bring it forward with the revisions and ask for your approval for moving forward. So no action tonight except for to take it and work it.
Thank you, Ms. Richards. I'd like to thank the staff, all of those of you that participated in the recommendations and suggestions, Mrs. Fisk, Mr. Solberg from Planning and Zoning, Larry Weil from Community Outreach, Jim Larson, Finance, Dustin Scott, obviously, all of the folks that had input and suggestions, and participated in all the special assessment meetings. All were held in the evenings. Obviously, we had 4 of them all over town from north to south, and all the commissioners were attending in those also. And so it was a great exercise in making us more aware of what the public is thinking. And with regard to particularly this evening, Mr. Anderson's comments and Mr. Lewis's comments, with regard to the communication, and there are some of us that are living in an analog world rather than a digital world, so I think that that's another good recommendation that we all have to have. So I also want to call attention to, it's been mentioned a couple of times about the prairie dog bill. That is a piece of North Dakota state legislation that was passed this year that has great potential for a growing community like West Fargo. By biennium, the city could enjoy up to $12,650,000 per biennium. And those dollars have been discussed by various members of the commission here. Obviously, we communicate one-on-one and, of course, with city staff as to how those dollars will both be spent. It has to be spent only on infrastructure. And there are 10 light items of how that money can be spent. And there's a reporting process, and if you fall outside of those reporting process, those dollars would not be coming back to you in following years. So we've had a great deal of discussion. That's another great avenue of how we can deal with some of the rising costs of special assessments. I think it's a very, very positive thing. The city of Bismarck has a utility tax, or a street tax, if you will, and the taxpayers there affectionately call it a pothole tax. But, you know, with regard to one of the other gentleman's comments this evening, the city of Bismarck just recently raised their water rates. I don't know if any of you have heard some of the discussion going on about that, because they were also trying to raise revenue for, you know, developments and improvements in infrastructure. And they surprised the public with, I've been told the multiplier is 4 times what the water rate was. And there's a public outcry right now. So, you know, utility fees and things like that, we need to also be very prudent on that. But they do have to, in my opinion, they have to stand alone, and the commissioners and I will certainly be very cautious as to how we approach those. So, commissioners, anything for final comments? Again, we thank you for your engagement and joining us this evening. Again, the Fargo, Moorhead, West Fargo Special Assessment next meeting is Friday morning at 7:30 a.m. at the Fargo City Hall, and we'd welcome you to come in and listen to that type of information too that's being presented. With that, Mr. Simmons.
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
They've been moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye. Aye. Yeah, we got
They're coachable. We stand adjourned. Again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening.